I'm José Halac, José Halac. I'm Giuliana's professor of composition at our National University of Córdoba. Next, the other guy you see is Luis Toro. Luis, I'll write it down too. He is also a composer, and he is the adjunct teacher of composition in the 5th year, also teaching the last year of Giuliana's.
To say thank you so much for your interest in my work and for reaching out. It's always wonderful to talk about work with other composers, so it's nice to meet you, and thank you.
Bueno, ¿cómo se origina IFF?
Well, yes, I guess you can say the title in any way. For some reason I say if, but it's coming from shorthand that's used in like logic. So the IFF is if and only if, like a conditional, like something that could be, but only if certain conditions are met. So the piece is really looking at kind of the difference between like the potential of something and then the potential of something contrasted with a more specific set of circumstances. Then I'll also say, if I can continue on a more practical level, the origin of the piece is, it's actually the last piece that I wrote as a student. So it was kind of my final composition when I was studying at McGill with Philippe Leroux. So it was created under the context of a residency for the student contemporary ensemble there, the McGill Contemporary Ensemble. So it's kind of, I view it as a kind of a bridge between my student and professional career in a way, because it's the last piece that I wrote with the guidance of a teacher.
¿Surge primero el título de la obra o en el proceso de la composición de la misma?
That's an interesting question. And I think that it's my habit in general to think conceptually very much about a piece before I ever start writing it. So almost all of my pieces begin with a title before I really get into the compositional work, because I think I reflect a lot. Even sometimes I have a program note written before I write a single note of music or work with a single sound. So in this case, that's very much true, where I spent a lot of reflection thinking about what I wanted to look at in the piece, and that idea then told me what to do musically more than the other way around.
Se nota mucho porque es bastante detallista en su partitura.
Thank you.
¿Cómo resultó el procedimiento de la composición? Si se tomó bastante tiempo en componer la obra.
It was during a period of my compositional activity where I was taking a lot longer to work on pieces than I am today, which I think was a very good, as I mentioned, it was my last piece that I wrote as a student, and so I had a lot of encouragement from my teacher to spend longer on pieces than I had been. So I think it was something like 6 months that I worked on that piece, which is relatively long compared to my current practice. But that permitted me to have a lot of reflection. And because it was in the context of this student ensemble, there was a postponement of the concert. And so I had actually finished the piece about half a year before it was to be premiered. And then that gave me a chance to go back and look at it after some months of reflection away from it and make some changes. So in this piece, I appreciated the opportunity to take a lot of time and reflect away from it in return, which I think is a really valuable thing, especially for me as a young composer. That was something that I learned a lot through while working on this piece.
James, ¿cuáles son tus influencias en la música y en la composición?
I guess that's a very big question, but I can say that my background was as an electroacoustic composer. And so I was writing acousmatic music before I ever had any interest or activity in classical music. And so I've never played an instrument or anything like that. And so I think that that really affects my writing as I transition to writing more and more for instruments. And so I think I'm often thinking about the music and the techniques associated with electroacoustic music when I'm writing instrumental music. And particularly coming from this tradition of the west coast of Canada, where there's soundscape music and thinking about the environment and acoustic ecology, I'm often really interested in sounds of the everyday, the quotidian, and the sounds around me, and the way that those can attach to personal memories and make associations. So that kind of thinking always influences and affects my writing. And I guess if we're talking about other people's music as well, that's definitely coming from like a tradition of working with people like Hildegard Westerkamp or Barry Truax. And then kind of the fact that I connected that to working with French composers like Philippe Leroux, I really started to adopt like spectral techniques of analyzing sound with computer-assisted methods. And so I think those kinds of approaches and ways of looking at music are really my initial formation. And then since then, I've become more and more interested in music that interacts very much with the context of concert performance. And so the visual aspect or the theater aspect or the ritual of a concert really informs me as much as anything in the music itself. And so I became really interested in composers like Carola Baukholt or Simon Steen Andersen or Patricia Alessandrini, these kind of composers who work a lot with not necessarily theater, like in the sense of like a Kago kind of approach, but more really like looking at the ritual of the concert and the performance practice as part of the piece.
Let me insert something that is not in the questionnaire, but when you said acoustical ecology, is that Schaeffer? Murray Schaeffer?
Totally, and that's where I went to. My initial schooling was at Simon Fraser University, where he was the first composition professor.
Okay.
And so that tradition is really like how I learned music. So that's really the beginning for me, and
Okay.
I still refer to it a lot.
Okay, I just wanted to point that out, that it's important. So also you went to McGill, right? Anything to do, or did you ever meet Alcides Lanza?
Oh yes, of course.
Because he's an Argentinian composer.
Yeah, we have, I think, a smallish community of Argentinian expat musicians here. There's also Ricardo Tafara, who teaches at Concordia.
Ricardo Alfarra, yes, sure.
It's nice connection. Yeah. And of course, like we have the Empreinte Digital label here, where I have something released, and so there's a lot of connection to like people like Esla Hustel. So yes, so but Alcides had stopped to teach at McGill when I was studying there, but he is still around, still quite active. He's over 90 now, still writing music, and really wonderful person.
Bien, tengo una pregunta sobre la electroacústica. ¿Cuáles son los objetivos en la obra con respecto a la distribución de los micrófonos y los altavoces en los instrumentos y en la sala?
Well, it's very elaborate in this piece, so I don't know if I can explain it all in appropriate detail right now, but there are several different layers at work. So all of the instruments are amplified, and they're quite closely amplified. And there is automation of the amplification in the patch. So the level of amplification is controlled in different areas of the piece. Certain instruments are amplified when others are not. And there's some fades and things like that. And the diffusion of the amplification into, I think it was 6 loudspeakers in the hall. So I really wanted to experiment with this feeling of the sounds being closer or farther away based on that automation of amplification and diffusion. Then there are also 2 speakers inside of or attached to instruments in stage. So there's 1 speaker inside of the piano, and there is a transducer speaker attached to an acoustic guitar, which is never played. There's no musician for it. And so there are moments in the piece where sound seems to be coming out of those instruments, but there's no corresponding physical gesture or performance to make that sound. And so I really wanted to play with this blurring of cause and effect, where, for example, sometimes the pianist might hit a key on the piano, and then from the speaker in the piano, that sound would be extended or transformed, or there would be a surprising sound coming from the guitar when no one is there playing it. So that was really the way in the piece, the main way that I wanted to explore this idea of cause and effect that is suggested by the title, that if something happens, then something else will happen, and kind of playing with that and breaking that expectation. And then that also connects to other things in the piece, like near the end, there is a moment where the musicians mime playing on their instruments, but there's a recording of them playing that happens at the same time. And the moments in the piece also with the percussionist with the suspended glass, about to strike the glass with a hammer, but he never does. And sound of glass breaking comes out from those speakers inside of the instruments at the end.
Bueno, tengo otra pregunta con respecto a el vidrio que nunca se rompe. Si fue una idea inicial de la obra o fue consecuencia de la obra.
Yes, I think similarly to the title, it was an idea that I had before. And before I started to compose, I was thinking of different images that to me are really connected to that idea of cause and effect. And I spent a good deal of time trying to think of an idea of working with the sound of billiard balls, like a pool with the bar game. And so I went and made a lot of recordings also of billiard balls, and I discarded that idea for the piece, thinking it didn't quite capture what I was looking for. And I thought like a really quite clear image of something cause and effect, breaking glass. Like we have this idea that it's something that's done and can't be undone. It transforms, you really see the result of the action, the object is changed. And so thinking about what we can do acoustically, however, like you can have a recording of glass breaking, really recognize that that's the sound of glass breaking. But if you manipulate it in a certain way, it almost feels like the sound has been restored to its state. So I wanted this image of like going back in time, having a glass shatter and then unshatter and then returning to its state. And so that was a lot of the initial thinking of the sounds that I wanted to use, and the idea to incorporate the theater of having a glass pane there and having the gesture of trying to break it, but never doing it, was something that came from that oral idea and was present before I really started to compose.
Y agrego a la pregunta, El uso de la mímica también está junto o relacionado al hecho del vidrio, del gesto del vidrio y la contradicción con el vidrio y el vidrio roto. Y sí, la relación entre el gesto de romper el vidrio en escena y el uso de la mímica por parte de los intérpretes al final de la obra.
Yes, I very much see them as connected ideas. So I think often when I have kind of a conceptual net of ideas that I want to work with in a piece, there are like connections between different ideas, and I don't know if it's exactly linear, but I see a big relationship between those things, and they both connect to this almost kind of acousmatic setting of the idea of when we listen to a sound on loudspeakers. Murray Schafer called it schizophonia, the separation of the sound from the gesture or its source, right? And so when we hear a recorded sound, it's not connected to the action or the physical object. And so in this piece, I really wanted, you have the action and you have the physical object on stage. So the musicians gesture to play their instruments, or the percussionist gestures to hit the glass. And then there is a sound that you would expect that action to make, but it doesn't come from that action. And so this ambiguity and this playfulness between physicality and sound is something that I saw in both of those explorations in the piece.
Bueno, prosigo. Hay dos obras anteriores que tienen algunas características en común con IFF, que es Object Interiors y Body Soundings. Son obras relacionadas en cuanto a la búsqueda experimental y a lo electroacústico.
Absolutely, and I think I could extend that even farther and say that there are a lot of links between my works, and there's overlap of the tools that I use or the conceptual concerns that they share, and even the musical elements that they share, sometimes using the same recordings. So it's very much a thing that I play with in my music, that there's a sense of a shared universe between the different pieces that I make. And in that case, it's a very direct line between having made two acousmatic works that had instruments on stage with transducers or speakers inside of the instrument. So like Objects Interiors has a speaker inside of the piano, and Body Soundings has a transducer speaker attached to an acoustic guitar, as well as a toy piano. That was a chance for me to explore those ideas and that same severance of cause and effect, and that acousmatic scenario being disrupted by some physical presence on stage in a different context. And so it was my first time exploring those ideas in the context of a work of chamber music, having instruments and musicians on stage and a conductor. So I very much saw if as a continuation or a new direction in examining those ideas that I had started to examine in those two work pieces.
She feels that in if you amplify the sonic universe already set or implemented or conceived in the other two shorter acousmatic pieces. That's what she feels about if.
No, this is maybe an area where, because it's been some years since I composed the piece, I perhaps don't remember all of the things I was thinking about in it, but I know that a lot of the pitches were derived from analysis of the recorded sounds that I had. And so that initial sound of glass breaking had a very resonant, I think, D6. And so that kind of the beginning of the piece is all centered around this one note and the kind of expanding away from a single pitch through the glissandi. And so that's why you have often like a cretali hit on this one note. And I was thinking a lot at the time of kind of spectral masks. So I did a lot of drawings of shapes over like vertically and horizontally over time, the kind of pitch map that I wanted. So I would, you know, start with a single line, and then it would turn into a triangle with the pitches that I would use, kind of more like registers rather than pitch classes. So like the register would expand in this direction up until this point, and then there would be a flip. So there are a lot of areas in the piece where you have like a high register sound centered around a single pitch that expands. It reaches a kind of breaking point, and then all the pitches are suddenly in the lower register. So it's a very kind of like Ligeti kind of, or Xenakis approach to sound of mapping out a sort of shape that I want to map into the pitches that I can use. But apart from that, I don't think there was a real sense of having a harmonic progression in the piece.
Con respecto, nosotros trabajamos un eje central que es el tema o el concepto o la concepción de la textura. ¿Podrías ofrecernos una definición, una idea, una concepción personal sobre la textura?
Yes, it's a big question again. I think the short answer is yes, I absolutely am thinking about texture a lot in my music and in this piece. But I think, at least in this piece, it's really much more of an intuitive approach to thinking about texture. And so I'm naturally kind of playing with the sound, and because there was such an electroacoustic element to this work, composing the electronic part at the same time as writing the score, a lot of the changes in texture come from that kind of studio approach of playing with the sound. And so trying out different manipulations of a recorded sound and extending it, stretching it, hearing what different textural changes happened as I did that. And so this level of the composition is something that tends to emerge more during the process for me. I think that a lot of the things we talked about are things that I had decided to do before I started writing. You know, the concept, the idea of a register map, thinking of where the sounds are going to be from high to low. But in terms of the texture, I think I had less of a sense of how I wanted that to develop over the piece until I started to write it. And so that really comes from a much more almost kind of tactile thing where I'm really playing with the sound, and as I'm listening to it or imagining it in my head, I think, well, if it becomes denser here or more active here, or kind of a rougher grain here versus a smoother sound, that's something that I allow myself to be much more playful with, I think. And yes, I don't know if I have like a very like rigid plan or description of how it worked in the piece, but it's something that I feel very much when I'm composing and listening.
Bien, bueno, en la obra, ¿hay algún aspecto central del cual consideres más importante, como por ejemplo el concepto, el sonido, la electroacústica, un objeto sonoro, el control de los timbres o lo tímbrico, lo gestual, lo escenográfico?
Yes, I guess that's another really difficult question to answer. I mean, my immediate feeling is I want to say everything is important and it's holistic, but I think if I can take a step back, I notice that the fact that I always start from a very kind of conceptual, philosophical point of view, I think that really becomes the most central thing for me in my thinking. I'm always returning, even if I'm thinking about the idea that is the pitch or the sound object or whatever, it's I'm thinking about how does that relate back to my concept every single time. So I think that that's, if there's like a central node, that's it. But I think maybe one of the best compliments that I ever received from a colleague was saying that they felt that my music was very conceptual, but different from the kind of tradition of conceptual music, where in my music they felt that the sound was equally important to the concept. And they pointed to a lot of, a lot of composers who are working in really conceptually, Johannes Kreidler or Peter Ablinger, like it's quite popular in Germany right now, where there's a lot of separation, like it's very much about the theater, the concept, and the sound is secondary. And those are composers I love very much too, but they were pleased to see how much the sound was like on equal footing with the concept. And so that's a value that I have very much. I'm always thinking about the sound and making an interesting or beautiful sound as much as I am thinking about the concept.
Now I insert my own, again, a small thing. Could that be, or could that have to do with you being an acousmatic, electroacoustic guy to begin with? The fact that you balance both things, sound and concept. Could that come from your electroacoustic passion for sound?
I think probably. Again, I don't really have like a counterfactual, so like I only have the experience that I had, so I don't know if it would be different if I had more of an instrumental formation at the beginning. But certainly, I think that the training that I had and my initial interest in music came from that kind of space, and so that's just stayed with me. But I can think of a lot of other composers who have an instrumental background who similarly have a kind of conceptual sound, like they similarly care about both things in equal weight. Like, I don't know, like Hugo Morales, I feel is really in this vein as well.
Okay.
¿Cómo estás trabajando en este contexto de pandemia en la actualidad?
But for, yes, with the pandemic, wow, it's a really difficult time to be a composer for everyone, I'm sure. When there are no concerts, it's hard to motivate to compose for some uncertain future. But the project I'm working on right now is for a group in Vancouver called Standing Wave, and it was supposed to premiere this year at the Gaudiamus Festival in the Netherlands, but that's cancelled, the physical festival. So the ensemble had the idea of trying to extract solos from the work so that they could take a bit, like the violin part could be separated and they could just play it themselves in their home, for example, or the piano part. So I had the idea to make a totally modular piece such that each instrumental part could be played just on its own, like you read your part and it's fine if you're playing alone, or like there could be a duo, the flute and the violin would work together, or the percussion, the piano and the cello would work together. It's a Pierrot and electronics piece, 6 instruments in electronics. And so I'm working through past recordings that I have of those instruments from studio recordings, and making an assembly, a mock-up of the entire piece from previous recordings that I have. And so that's also referencing past pieces of mine because they're recordings taken from previous studio recordings of pieces. And then assembling it electronically and then transcribing it. And doing that all with an electronic part as well. So that from the 7 different parts, flute, clarinet, violin, cello, percussion, piano, electronics, there are 127 possible different combinations of the work. So they could play all 7 parts together, or just 3 of them, or just 2 of them. And so I'm curious to hear all the different combinations, and working like that with recordings, it allows me to kind of solo and mute different tracks to hear how they sound together. And it's a very highly detailed notated work. So it's not like an open score where, you know, any instrument could play any part. It's very like, this is a violin part. It's very clearly for the instrument. So it's really challenging and very difficult. And it's something that will only really make sense when we can have concerts again. But for now, the pianist is going to play like a streamed version of an excerpt from his part. So yes, definitely the conditions of the ensemble not being able to be together to rehearse and make a concert have influenced completely the idea of this piece and turned it into something that I never would have thought of on my own.
Creo que ahora me quedo pensando mucho más en la obra y en lo que uno interpreta y comprende desde una experiencia propia, compartiendo la experiencia con el compositor.
Well, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to talk about music and a chance to meet you. And these situations are always kind of funny where I'm obviously talking about myself the whole time. So I feel a bit bad that I'm just meeting you, and I'd like to discover your music as well and hear more. But I will, I guess, look you all up and see if you have websites and works online. I'm looking forward to discovering some new music from this.
Sí, la verdad que estoy muy agradecida por esta oportunidad de conocerte y también de conocer tu música, que realmente se me abrió otro universo. Y quería justamente trabajar sobre algo más vigente, ¿sí? Sobre un compositor joven, sobre alguien que me genere interés y que me abra justamente el panorama a nivel sonido, a nivel instrumentación, a nivel electroacústica. Y bueno, muchísimas gracias por la oportunidad.
All right, James. We'll let you go.
Okay,
Thank you.
take care.
Thank you. Take care.
Day.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.